Aftermath of the deadly ICE shooting that killed Minnesota resident Renee Good. At least 6 prosecutors in the state's U.S. Attorney's Office have now resigned. This is in the wake of the office being tasked with investigating the shooting. Joe Thompson is included in that list of resignations. Thompson led the effort to probe widespread fraud in Minnesota's social programs, securing more than 60 convictions in just the last year. Now, this comes as state and local officials have filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration over its immigration enforcement. The lawsuit alleges ICE agents are threatening public safety. Lana, what else can you tell us?
Hi there, Liz. In addition to those resignations that you mentioned, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division is also seeing more resignations in protest into how this investigation into the shooting death of Renee Good unfolded. And we are also learning more about the details of that lawsuit by the state of Minnesota against federal agents.
Hi, everyone. Adam Reddy. So what just happened? There are moments in political life that transcend normal controversy and enter the realm of the genuinely humiliating. Pam Bondi experienced one of those moments on national television when she sat down with Hannity and tried to explain why her Justice Department is hemorrhaging attorneys at a rate never seen in American history.
What happened in Minnesota? We had 6 prosecutors who suddenly decided they didn't want to support the men and women in ICE. One of them was busy doing a photo shoot with the New York Times while ICE was out there risking their lives. So they came, they said, we want to resign, but we want to use our annual leave up until April, meaning they wanted the taxpayers to pay for them to go on vacation because they decided they didn't want to support law enforcement. So the breaking news tonight, I fired them all. They're fired from the office. And our U.S. attorney there, Rosen, he's great. He was just confirmed 3 months ago. So he has his hands full. And that's what we're facing around the country, the deep state, in many of these offices. And we learned these people had been out there interviewing at liberal law firms prior to this. But I'll tell you what, from a personnel level, that'd be an HR nightmare. So people better look into them. One of them actually in 2022 defended BLM when they burned down a pawn shop and someone was murdered. Yeah, they want to be part of the resistance. Yeah, bring it on. They're not going to be working for Donald Trump and the Department of Justice.
But instead of projecting strength and control, instead of demonstrating the steady hand of the nation's top law enforcement officer, Bondi melted down. She cried. She whined. She played the victim while the country watched and wondered how the Department of Justice became this.
Yeah, and Sean, in April, I did a memo rescinding Merrick Garland's memo saying that reporters will not be subpoenaed. We will not look at reporters' phones. I rescinded that because we have to protect our classified information and the heroic men and women in the military. And Sean, the First Amendment is a bedrock principle, but this isn't about that. This is about classified material that could jeopardize lives. And this IT guy that worked for Department of War, and Pete Hegseth has been amazing, and he's up against a lot with these people. This guy that worked, he was a contractor, IT contractor, who had classified information, is charged now with leaking classified information involving a foreign adversary. He could jeopardize the lives, the safety of our men and women in the military.
The numbers alone tell a devastating story. More than 3,000 attorneys have quit or been fired from the Justice Department in less than a year. 3,000. That is roughly triple the normal annual departure rate. But numbers don't capture the moral dimension of what is happening. The 6 top federal prosecutors in Minnesota didn't just resign. They walked out because Pam Bondi ordered them to criminally investigate the widow of Renee Nicole Good, the woman murdered by ICE agent Jonathan Ross.
And I'm Kelsey Carlson. It was another busy day as ICE enforcement continued across the Twin Cities. But today we're learning that the U.S. Attorney's Office for Minnesota may be losing some key prosecutors.
Fox 9's Karen Scullen is in our newsroom for us, joining us now to take us through what was a New York Times report. Karen, it appears some well-known people, some names are among those resigning.
Right, definitely. Joe Thompson, the lead investigator into the massive fraud here in Minnesota, has resigned. He is well respected by many in the U.S., the state here, and local leaders. It's not clear who will replace him as lead prosecutor or any of the others who have now resigned. The U.S. attorney prosecuting the massive Minnesota fraud investigation has resigned. Joe Thompson has stepped down. The New York Times reporting 5 others have also stepped away. They cite people with knowledge of the decision and say it was over the Justice Department's push to investigate the widow of a woman killed by an ICE agent and the department's reluctance to investigate the shooter,
while simultaneously ordering them not to investigate the actual killer, investigate the victim's widow, ignore the government agent who pulled the trigger. That was the order, and those prosecutors looked at that order and said no. They looked at an attorney general who wanted them to use the power of the United States government to terrorize a grieving family while protecting a murderer in uniform, and they chose their integrity over their careers. They quit.
At least 6 top prosecutors in Minnesota are resigning in protest of how the Trump administration is handling last week's ICE-involved shooting in which an ICE agent killed 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good. This includes Joe Thompson, who served as acting U.S. attorney in Minnesota. A source says this follows days of pressure to focus the DOJ investigation not on the actions of the ICE agent who shot and killed Renee Good, but to focus the investigation on Good and others around her. The New York Times reporting this includes Good's widow. And indeed, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche today released a statement saying that the Justice Department does not believe there's evidence to back a criminal investigation into the ICE officer. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz called the resignations a huge loss, writing on X, quote, "It's also the latest sign that Trump is pushing nonpartisan career professionals out of the Justice Department, replacing them with his stance," unquote. Thompson, by the way, the acting U.S. attorney, previously led the office's effort to tackle social services fraud in the state. That's an issue that's high on the Trump administration's priority list.
And Bondi's response was to go on television and cry about it. Let's be clear about what happened in Minnesota. These were not low-level functionaries. These were the main federal prosecutors handling fraud investigations, including cases initiated by the previous administration to root out corruption. These were career professionals with decades of experience and impeccable reputations, and Pam Bondi wanted them to become weapons of political retaliation. She wanted them to go after the widow of a woman murdered by a federal agent because the administration needed to manufacture justification for the killing. When those prosecutors refused, when they made clear they would not participate in covering up a murder, Bondi told them they were fired and would lose their benefits. They didn't wait to be fired. They said, bye-bye. We don't want to be part of your piece of trash, DOJ, your utter embarrassment, your child sex trafficking cover-up ring. That is what career federal prosecutors think of the Attorney General of the United States. The resignations didn't stop in Minnesota. At least 4 or 5 top attorneys from the Civil Rights Division at Main Justice in Washington, D.C. also walked out for the exact same reason. They were ordered not to investigate the killer of Renee Nicole Good. They were ordered to go after her widow instead, and they refused. These are the people who dedicated their careers to civil rights enforcement, to protecting the vulnerable, to ensuring that justice is blind, and Pam Bondi asked them to become executioners of that vision. They chose integrity. Bondi chose Hannity. The total number now exceeds 3,000 attorneys. That is not a rounding error. That is not normal attrition. That is an institutional collapse. When nearly 3,000 lawyers walk away from the most prestigious legal employer in the country, when they choose unemployment over continued service, something has gone catastrophically wrong at the top. And Bondi's explanation for this exodus is that the departing attorneys were interviewing at liberal law firms. That is her defense. These weren't principled resignations over immoral orders. They were just looking for better jobs. Never mind that the resignations happened immediately after orders to prosecute widows and protect killers. Never mind that the Civil Rights Division attorneys left specifically because they were told to abandon civil rights. Bondi went on television and cried about lawyers wanting to work somewhere else. The humiliation deepened when she was asked about the FBI executing a search warrant at the home of Washington Post reporter Hannah Natanson. Natanson, known as the federal government whisperer, developed more than 1,100 sources within the federal government, whistleblowers who came forward to expose the illegal activities of DOJ and the Trump administration. Bondi ordered the FBI to raid her home. They seized her phones, her personal laptops, her journalist equipment. Why? To find out who her sources were. To intimidate anyone who might consider talking to the press about what is happening inside this administration. Bondi sat on Hannity and said this was perfectly normal. This is just what we do. No, Pam. That is what authoritarian regimes do. That is not what the Department of Justice does in a democratic society. But Bondi has made clear that rescinding protections for reporters was a priority. She bragged about canceling Merrick Garland's memo directing the DOJ not to target journalists. She wanted the world to know that under her leadership, reporters have no protection from prosecution for doing their jobs. Then there were the stooges. Bondi and Trump sent their mega sycophants out to defend the indefensible. Lauren Boebert was asked about the DOJ failing to turn over Epstein files in violation of the Epstein Transparency Act. Her response was that the DOJ is releasing quite a bit. They have released approximately 1% of the records. 1%. The DOJ is operating as a criminal racketeering enterprise engaged in covering up a child sex trafficking ring, and Lauren Boebert thinks 1% is quite a bit. Tim Burchett was equally useless, mumbling through non-answers while the country waits for the truth about Epstein that Bondi's DOJ is actively suppressing. Meanwhile, Democratic Congressman Ryan was asked about the Ford worker in Detroit who called Trump a pedophile protector and was suspended from his job. His response stood in stark contrast to the MAGA Defense Force. He talked about free speech and workers' rights and the importance of telling truth to power. That is what accountability looks like. That is what moral clarity sounds like. Bondi's allies cannot muster even that much. The Brian Cole situation adds another layer of absurdity to this nightmare. Cole is the suspected pipe bomber, a two-time Trump voter who was at the Capitol on January 6th. His lawyer is now arguing that because Trump pardoned January 6th defendants, and because those pardons extend to related conduct, Cole should be pardoned too. He responded to Trump's call. He did what the president wanted. Why shouldn't he get the same protection as everyone else who answered that call? The logic is consistent with everything this administration has done. If you commit violence on behalf of Trump, you are a patriot deserving of pardon. If you are murdered by a federal agent, you are a domestic terrorist whose widow should be prosecuted. The moral inversion is complete. The rule of law is dead, and Pam Bondi is its executioner. Mayor Jacob Frey of Minneapolis provided the clearest articulation of what is actually happening on the ground. When a Fox host tried to cross-examine him about the fraud investigations and the prosecutor resignations, Frey cut through the noise. You want to know something? Don't you all pretend that you care about the fraud. The prosecutors who were involved in those cases all resigned. You realize that's going to make us far less safe. Then he went further, describing what ICE is actually doing in American cities. We have a separation ordinance in the city. It says, I want our limited numbers of police officers focusing on keeping people safe, arresting violent criminals, stopping car thefts. You know what I don't want them focusing on? Hunting down a dad that just dropped his kids off at daycare, is about to go work a 12-hour shift, who happens to be from Ecuador. That guy makes our city a better place. And then Frey said something that every American should hear and understand. American citizens are being taken off our streets right now. People who are American citizens are being picked up by federal agents. We should all be saying, let's take a beat. Let's think this through. Maybe this isn't right. There are two sides to this story. That is the voice of sanity in a moment of madness. That is a mayor watching his city being terrorized by federal agents and having the courage to say it out loud. Pam Bondi sat on Hannity and cried about lawyers leaving her department. She cried about being criticized. She cried about the injustice of people not wanting to work for someone who orders them to prosecute widows and protect killers. She did not cry for Renee Nicole Good. She did not cry for the family of a woman murdered by a federal agent. She did not cry for the journalists being raided for doing their jobs. She cried for herself. And that is the perfect metaphor for everything that is wrong with this administration. Self-pity for the powerful while the powerless suffer. Tears for the Attorney General while the victims of her policies have no one to cry for them. 3,000 attorneys have left the Department of Justice. 6 top prosecutors in Minnesota walked out rather than follow illegal orders. The Civil Rights Division is gutted. The Epstein files remain hidden. Journalists are being raided. Widows are being targeted for prosecution. And Pam Bondi is on television crying because people don't want to work for her. The humiliation is complete. The moral bankruptcy is total. And the country is watching.